This is Steve Zeltzer with Workweek in Pacifica, and we've covered the attack on faculty members, professors, academics who have come under attack because they're critical of Israel and also of Zionism. And one of the people that we've interviewed in the past is David Miller. He was a professor at the University of Bristol, and has been a long struggle after a discharge by the university for his political viewpoints. And this week he won a successful tribunal ruling. So welcome to our show, David.
Thank you. It's great to be back.
So David, why don't you talk about what happened this week in this decision, because it's been a long struggle that you've been in, as well as other academics who are fighting for the right to speak up about these issues.
Yes, I mean, there of course has been since, my tribunal started on the 16th of October last year, so 9 days after the launch of Al-Aqsa Flood, when the Palestinian resistance factions broke out of Gaza and launched that operation that they engaged in then. And during the tribunal, there was a lot of discussion from the university's council about my tweets about Al-Aqsa Flood and about the claims about the alleged beheaded babies and the mass rapes and the civilian casualties and all of that kind of thing, which I was, along with many other people in independent media, questioning the propaganda which the Israelis had released. So it was a very kind of a strange time for the tribunal to happen. It had been 2 years in the making, but it starts just 9 days after Al-Aqsa Flood. And of course, there's a huge attempt by the university at that early stage to say that my views were terrible and not worthy of respect in a democratic society. They were, in the technical sense, akin to Nazism, and this was illustrated by my apparent support of Hamas and all this kind of stuff, right? So there's an attempt to do all that. But of course, as the time went on during the tribunal, and the Zionist genocide in Gaza became more and more visible day after day to everyone around the world. That became a difficult circumstance for the university, and that's the backdrop to what happened. In the end, what happened, the judgment of the tribunal, was that I had been wrongfully dismissed because the university had investigated me in a way which wasn't adequate. The person who investigated me in the end admitted they hadn't followed the proper rules. They hadn't investigated my side of the story. They'd only investigated the effect of my words on, or the alleged effect of my words on students. They hadn't investigated all the evidence that I'd submitted to the inquiry. And the university witnesses also admitted effectively that they hadn't properly evaluated whether I should be sacked as a result of that investigation, so that I was wrongfully dismissed. And that, of course, is the key thing I was going for in the first place. But the more important element of the case, which is the second part of what we should talk about, was that I alleged that the reason that I had been sacked was that because of my anti-Zionist views. That it wasn't anything really to do with the reasons that the university gave. The university said the reason I was sacked was because students had been upset by what I'd said, that Zionist students had said they felt unsafe as a result of my anti-Zionist views. And it was those effects of what I had said which were the real reason for me being sacked. But when they came under cross-examination, both the person who investigated me and the person who sacked me effectively admitted that actually the really bad stuff that I'd done was the anti-Zionism. It wasn't the stuff about the students, it was the anti-Zionism. And the university's own witnesses effectively undermined the university's case that I had been sacked for these other reasons. And so that meant that the court decided that I had been sacked because of my anti-Zionist views, and also determined that the anti-Zionist views that I espoused were, to use the technical language, worthy of respect in a democratic society, and thus are protected philosophical beliefs under the UK Equality Act of 2010. So it's now illegal, based on the precedent of my case, to discriminate against people on the basis of their anti-Zionist views. So that's a huge breakthrough, and it will be available for everybody else in the UK in any job to defend themselves, not just academics, any job. People cannot be sacked now for being anti-Zionists, and that's the most important element of the case, and the most lasting element of it, which will go forward in the future.
And one of the things that has been going on is an international effort of the Zionists to say that if you're critical of Israel, you're an anti-Semite. you're
Yeah,
anti-Semitic. Is that contained also in this kind of campaign against you and other academics, that you're anti-Semitic because you're critical of Israel?
of course. I mean, they've been trying to do this for a long, long time. I mean, the Israeli Foreign Minister Abba Eban famously said this in 1972, that anti-Zionism is the new anti-Semitism. It's not so much anti-Semitism of the old neo-Nazi type, which the Jews face. It's the anti-Semitism of anti-Zionism. And of course, they've been trying to encourage that notion ever since the 1970s, and in particular in the period since 2000, they've set up something called the Global Forum for Countering Anti-Semitism, which worked for years and years and is still working on blurring the difference between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. So that's their line. There's no distinction. And now the great thing about this case, though, is it's not just that it will protect people from being anti-Zionists, it also fundamentally undermines that key Zionist foreign policy talking point, which is that there's no distinction. There is a distinction. The courts have determined in the UK that there is a distinction, and that anti-Zionist views are worthy of respect in democratic society, i.e. they are not akin to Nazism and they are not racism. So that's a real coach and horses driven through that definition created by the Zionists and institutionalized in, of course, the 2016 adoption of the working definition by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, which is of course the main weapon that they have used to beat the pro-Palestine movement in the past 8 or 9 years. So it's a coaching horses through that attempt to bring those two concepts together, and I don't know that it can survive that. So I think it's the beginning of the end of those kinds of propaganda notions that the Israelis encourage.
And you set up a research institute that began to investigate the relationship of the Zionists, the Israeli state, to propaganda and the influence of the public and the influence of society. What did your institute do, and why did they see that as such a threat to their public persona?
Well, I mean, actually, the organization I set up, Public Interest Investigations, which runs two websites, spinwatch.org and powerbase.info, was set up to examine, as the term spin watch tells you, to examine propaganda and spin in the wake of the Iraq war. And so we did a lot of work on government propaganda, yes, on lobbying and on corporate lobbying, on environmental public relations and greenwashing, and a whole range of things that were of interest to essentially the anti-globalization movement of the period. We only got into doing the Zionism thing much later, partly as a result of research we did on two neoconservative think tanks in the UK. We did this work because we were looking at the way in which they pushed Islamophobia. And so we examined them from the point of view of understanding why was Islamophobia being pushed in the UK. And it was these neoconservative think tanks that did it. And we looked at who had funded these think tanks. And one of the things we found was that there was all these obscure British charities, much like foundations in the US, which were funding the Islamophobia of these think tanks. And we didn't understand at the time, but these, in the end, we discovered, because we looked at what else they funded, were Zionist family foundations, much like the Zionist family foundations you get in the US, which fund Islamophobia, the Middle East Forum or whatever. So we only really started to understand that this was actually, the Zionists were pushing Islamophobia, and we hadn't understood that before, and that took us off into direct examination of the Israel lobby, of the Zionist movement, the broader Zionist movement. And the thing which they didn't like, well, the thing which they complained about me, the first complaint in this process, I started at the University of Bristol 2018, and in February 2019, I gave a lecture on Islamophobia where I spent a short time in the lecture talking about the role of Zionism based on this research in pushing Islamophobia. And they just really didn't like that because they style themselves as being anti-racist. So they couldn't have it said that they were actually driving anti-Muslim racism in the UK, which of course they are. And so that was the thing which led to their first complaint. And as a result, because I wouldn't back down, I wouldn't apologize, they really hated me. And they, as you can see on social media, they continue to really hate me. And that's the lesson of this, though, if that's the question, what this question leads to. The lesson is that, that when you're faced with the vitriol and the intimidation and the bullying and the trolls and the lies and the smears from the Zionists and their myriad of organizations in the US and the UK and elsewhere, the way to beat them is not to apologize and try and be reasonable and try and negotiate with them, because that never works. The way to deal with this is to fight, is to say, I'm an anti-racist, you're the racists, and will not be called racists by these actual racists, and to fight back against them. And that's what I've done, and it's been difficult. I lost my job, I lost my means of earning a living. I can now never get a job in British academia, even having been cleared. I think it's unlikely. So there was a real attempt to destroy me as an individual. But there was no choice for me once we engaged in this process. I was saying things which were based on my research. I couldn't pretend that the research didn't say that. And so my solution to this was to fight, was to say no, that Zionism is racism, and it always will be racism. It's a genocidal ideology, and it will always be a genocidal ideology. And there's no way of getting around that. And they don't like that very much, and so they come at you. And in this case, I'm very, very glad to say they have totally failed.
And one of the things that most Americans are unaware of is that the invasion of Iraq and the campaign to invade Iraq was financed by think groups, by Zionists who wanted the United States to invade Iraq. And this has continued now with Israel wanting the United States to go to war with other countries as an accomplice. What is the relationship of this propaganda to imperialist war that's going on now and the danger of a world war?
Well, I saw that Tucker Carlson, I think today, has made a statement about the way in which Netanyahu is a massive threat to world peace, and that the Americans should really invade Israel and take down the Zionists. And what's, I think, interesting about this period is that this is the kind of thing which the left would not even say as much as that. But this used to be a left-wing position, more or less. But now we've got the sections of the American right are coming around to the idea that actually that Israel is not a benefit. It's not the on the leash attack dog used by US imperialism. It's actually off the leash, and it's actually a threat to US imperial interests, never mind the interests of peace and security of West Asia and indeed of the rest of the world. So I think that we're starting to see the unraveling of the Zionist project, which at the level of both of the kind of the debate about this. So sections of the American right coming around to the position that the left has had, that Zionism is racism and is anti-Muslim. But at the same time, we also see directly in occupied Palestine that the Zionists are losing the military struggle against the Palestinian resistance in Gaza. They're losing, are scared of going into to Lebanon to take on Hezbollah, who the last time this happened, Hezbollah beat them, and Hezbollah is way more militarily significant now than it was then. They're also, of course, facing the threat from Yemen and the boycott that Ansarallah have effectively imposed on them. And even the Americans, their key ally, are a bit scared of taking on Ansarallah directly, which is pretty extraordinary. So we're living in a period where all of these things are coming together. So the pushback against Zionism is beginning to start. And of course, people will say to me, well, look what happened at Penn, look what happened at Harvard, look at all the people who've been sacked. And I take all that. They're doing very well with having people sacked, and they are pushing forward to squash the space for debate in Palestine. But we equally are pushing back. And the reason we're pushing back so successfully, I think, I'll finish on this, is that millions and millions of people all over the world, including in the centers of hegemonic power in the US and the UK and other Western states, millions and millions of people for the first time see that the stuff that we've been saying for years, that Zionism is genocidal, is just straightforwardly and obviously true. And that genie cannot be put back in its box. The mask has slipped. The Israelis are actually trying to encourage us to believe the worst possible things about them by their actions. It's quite clear that they're doing this deliberately. So that can't go back in its box. So we're facing the very real possibility of the collapse of the Zionist project, and that's, I think, something which we should all be optimistic about.
And you say one of the lessons of your struggle was not to backtrack and apologize, but to go on the offensive. What are the lessons of Jeremy Corbyn and the kind of attack on him? And what was the role of Zionism in the attack of removing Jeremy Corbyn and going after him and others by the leadership of the Labour Party?
So I had never been in a mainstream political party until I heard that Jeremy Corbyn had put his hat in the ring for the leadership of the party in early 2015. I went to the first meeting that he had in Bristol, which is just up the road from where I'm currently sitting in early 2015. I was a strong supporter of Corbyn. I was, of course, investigated after Zionist complaints. Eventually, I had to resign from the party before they actually resigned from the party 3 hours before the party expelled me. So I was part of that process, right? What I couldn't understand was why did they continue to apologize? Why did Jeremy and others apologize and have a strategy apparently of apologize, move on, the news cycle will move on, people will forget. And that was a strategy which was disastrous, which led to one after another of Jeremy's closest supporters and best supporters being thrown under the bus, being expelled from the party, being forced out. And in the end, by 2019, Jeremy had nobody left to defend him. And I think that was this is the contrast I would draw. The strategy adopted by the leadership of the leader of the Whig Party's office, Jeremy Corbyn's office, by his advisors, was the apologise, try and be nice to the Zionists, and that doesn't work. And it, of course, meant the political assassination of Jeremy Corbyn. On the contrary, my view has been that you don't do that. You make a stand for what you believe in, which is that Zionism is racism. And once you do that, you start to explain it. Then people begin to see that, and I think that's been successful in my case. Certainly, we now have this principle established, which, as I said, drives a coach and horses through the Zionist idea that there's no difference between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, which of course there plainly is.
And you just recently had the visit of Javier Milei to Israel, who's become a big ardent Zionist. He's a fascist, and you have a history of Zionism collaborating with not only the British Empire, the Balfour Agreement, but also Nazis. They invited Adolf Eichmann to go to Palestine to support the idea of an Israeli state or Jewish state. And the relationship of Zionism to fascism and fascist movements internationally, what is the record of that? Because it seems like it's accelerating.
Yeah, I mean, this is hugely controversial, and of course that's part of what led to people being expelled from the party, when they said things which were historically accurate, but which people don't want to know about, like the Havana Agreement of 1933, where the Zionists collaborated with the Nazis. But this is well known, and of course there's lots of books about it. Lenny Brenner's book, of course, is the most famous one. But since I've been sacked, I started to do a TV program called Palestine Declassified, which is a weekly TV show, half-hour TV show. And we've done a lot of investigations of Zionism and its history, etc. And one of the early things we came up with just after the special military operation by Russia was launched, was the strange relationship between Ukrainian nationalism and the origins of Zionism. And I hadn't really appreciated that at the time, but the people who committed the atrocities against the Jews in the Second World War in Ukraine were associated with they were part of the Waffen-SS. They were Ukrainian SS officers, and these were the people, the faction which became the Waffen-SS, were the people who prior to the Second World War had been in an alliance with a guy called Vladimir Jabotinsky, who of course grew up in Odessa, which was a settler colony, founded as a settler colony by Catherine the Great. And he's the founding father of the revisionist Zionist movement, with which, of course, Netanyahu has all his life been associated. So you saw that in that period there was a conception of Jewish nationalism, which was very similar to the Ukrainian nationalist conceptions, which led to fascism, and actually led to the killings and murders of thousands of Jews in Ukraine. And Jabotinsky famously said, when on my death, in the cemetery on the headstone, they will say, "Here lies the man who made the deal with Simon Petliura, the fascist leader in Ukraine," and he was conscious of that. And so, yeah, of course, there's that connection, but with ultra nationalism of the kind of fascist type, which we see, which of course in the end leads to pogroms against the Jews. But also we see that in the contemporary period. I mean, people don't know, I guess, this, but the Azov battalion, one of the Nazi militias created after the Maidan in Ukraine in 2014. It was founded by, well, it was founded by two guys. One of them was an ex-IDF officer. Right? So there are actually Jews fighting the Russians in the Nazi Azov battalion. Not just the guy that founded it, Beletsky, but others as well. And that's the craziness of Zionism, isn't it? That actually they're not too far away from actual fascist ideas. And of course, now we've seen what's happening in Gaza. That kind of statement, which 4 months ago would have been a hanging offence and an indication of anti-Semitism, and you're making Nazi comparisons, and that's definitely anti-Semitic. Now, that genie can't be put back in its box either. I mean, it's very clear that this is a genocide, and that these kinds of comparisons are legitimate.
And the role of the US government as an accomplice and propagandist of Zionist positions, beheading of babies, repeated by the US government. It seems that the American people, for the first time, are seeing that these kind of genocidal policies are openly supported by the US government. They become propagandists for the Zionist regime.
Yeah, of course, the US is the most important of the supporters of the genocide. The UK has been actively involved too. Its military have been involved in spy flights and sharing intelligence information with the so-called IDF. So yes, I mean, it's important to understand that, but also to understand that the kind of the places where that support might become conditional. So I see that Hillary Clinton has been calling for Netanyahu to go. The State Department, prior to Al-Aqsa flood, has been funding the movement for quality government in Israel, the key people who are doing the protests against Netanyahu. So there's a kind of ambivalence at the heart of US imperial power, at the same time as there is the direct support being given and the weapons being sent and the money which pays for the weapons to directly kill. And of course, there's been US military personnel on the ground in Gaza, which we found out about very, very early on in the period. So the question is, when is it that the US will say enough? And I think we're approaching the time when that might become the case. And I say that not because the US is particularly bothered by thousands and thousands of dead children and being complicit in that, but because the US is a hegemon in decline, most obviously through its massive defeat in Ukraine. I've just been listening to the BBC News, which I rarely do these days, in the car on the way back to the house, and they're talking as if the Ukrainian counteroffensive wasn't really that successful, as if actually they've lost the war. This is the three separate armies have been systematically dismembered and dismantled by the Russians, and that's a massive historical defeat for the whole of NATO and especially for the US. But the second point I would make is that in the cards played by Ansarallah in Yemen have been a truly extraordinary sign of the weakness of the US empire. I mean, Yemen is one of the poorest countries in the world. It's suffered an appalling attack by the Saudis, supported by the Americans, etc. And now Ansarallah controls some 85% of the population, has most of the army, and most of the weapons which were provided by the Saudis have gone over to Ansarallah. And so when Ansarallah announced this boycott, started attacking Israeli ships or ships going to Israel, and the Americans said, we're going to have this thing, what was it called? Operation Protect Prosperity. I mean, they could have paid the person who came up with that slogan a bit better. And what immediately happened was that the US Navy said, oh, guys, we haven't got the ships. We can't do this. And then the French, the Italians, and the Spanish said, actually, we're out. We're not part of this anymore. And then the Americans said, well, we're not really sure we should attack Yemen in a full frontal way, because what could happen is that they could fire some of these missiles that they've got, and they could sink American ships. And that was the end. And of course, there's been some demonstration attacks where they've warned Ansarallah and they've evacuated the bases. And yes, they've killed some people, but this is not raising the ante, because the US is scared of taking on Ansarallah. It knows, and it doesn't, of course, tell anyone this, but it knows that those boats in the Red Sea, in the Med, are sitting targets for the missiles that Ansarallah have, and can't be repelled by the air defense they have. Some of it would work, but some of it wouldn't. And they can see that these are effectively large metal targets, which cannot be defended. And so that we see that the much vaunted projection of naval power by the US behemoth, it stands exposed as what did the Vietnamese say, as a paper tiger.
It's a
And I
paper
think
tiger, yeah.
yeah, I mean that's what we see, and I think people haven't realized the full magnitude of this. Every day, the US power and the ability to project power is declining, and that's the historic period we're in, and that's why I think at some point they will have to tell the Israelis to stop.
And of course, this attack on Iraq. Iraq is now saying, get out. They have bases in Iraq. They have bases all over, 800 US military bases all over the world. While the infrastructure is falling apart in the United States, while you have hunger, people homeless, the economic conditions are, terrible for millions of people. But the trillions of dollars going for the military war machine continue. And that's coming to a limit. People are angry about these conditions. Yeah. Now, you won your case. Are you going to get your job back?
I don't know. We have a hearing. It's not been listed yet in the court, but a hearing called a Remedies hearing. I love the sound of that word, remedies. Uh,
And
and
also
that's when
suits against the slander against you. Massive slander campaign by the Zionists against you.
yeah, that's right. And that's when we'll find out what kind of compensation I will get, whether I'll get my job back. I imagine that the university will have some things to say about that if the court ordered it. But let's see. I mean, clearly I'm going to get some kind of compensation. It's not, I mean, the way that which the law operates, it's not going to be adequate compensation. You can't, for example, claim your legal fees, which have been, in a case like this, massive. And so I've had a crowdfunder going on that, which has raised a lot of money, but we still have a fair slog to go to raise the rest of the money for my legal fees. But the way in which the law operates in general is that you get roughly a year's salary, unless you're ordered reinstatement, in which case you get all your back wages. But the only additional sum I might get on top of that is that when one is discriminated against, as the court determined I had been, by direct discrimination because of my political views, that the cap of 1 year's salary comes off, and they can award you a sum of several thousands or tens of thousands more. I don't anticipate that's going to be great, but I think that the claim I will make will be, of course, a full claim for the losses that I've faced, which have been very, very significant, actually. I mean, people don't understand, I guess. They think it's sad or that it's wrong, but they don't understand that once you've lost the job. I've been an academic for 30 years, and just one day that was over. No more, and no possibility of getting another academic job because I was slandered as an anti-Semite. The university refused to tell anyone that they had two QC-led reports. That's a lawyer doing an external report, an external lawyer doing a report. They had 2 reports on me, both of which concluded there wasn't a single thing I'd ever said which was anti-Semitic. But the university wouldn't even tell anyone that. They just said, "Oh, he hasn't said anything which breaks the law." And that was all they would say, and that really is a disgrace. That's an attempt to blacken my name and destroy my reputation by the university, my employer, never mind by the Zionists, who of course were doing the same thing.
And of course, in the United States now, there is retaliation against people even support the ceasefire. Academics are being fired. News journalists are being fired. Some from the LA Times signed a petition for a ceasefire. They were prevented from doing work in the Middle East, covering that. It seems like there's a purge by the Zionists and their supporters in the United States against anyone, particularly academics and journalists, who raise any issues around the issue of Zionism.
Yeah, yes, of course there is, and we shouldn't underestimate that. And of course they're in many respects they're winning. Susan Sarandon sacked by her talent agency. I see Roger Waters just the other day sacked by his music publisher. Now, of course, sometimes we say that that it's important to understand the role of the Zionists here, and I think it's important to think this through, what that means. Now, some people talk about the Israel lobby. Of course, Mearsheimer and Walt's famous book of that title looks at the lobbying groups, the AIPACs and the Foundation for the Defense of Democracy, etc., and their role in lobbying for Zionist policies, and that's really important to look at that. But the Zionist movement is a much wider and broader phenomenon than that. all of the key Zionist organizations which raised money for ethnic cleansing in Palestine, none of them were examined in Meir Walt's book because they're not directly lobbying to change US foreign policy. They're instead, organizing to encourage ethnic cleansing. So it's important for us to think about how it is that a kind of witch hunt like this can be successful. And part of the reason is that the Zionist movement is a much broader kind of beast than people understand, but also it's that the Zionists are well distributed throughout the society. So at the top of media corporations, in Hollywood, in social media, there are tons of people who are card-carrying lifelong Zionists, in many cases with social media corporations, as the brilliant work at Min Press has shown. These are people who have previously been either in US intelligence or indeed Israeli intelligence, who are at the top of Twitter or Instagram or Facebook or whatever. So there's a real problem that it's not just that there are Zionist lobby groups and the Zionist movement organizing for ethnic cleansing in Palestine, but there's also throughout our political, economic, and cultural system, Zionists at key places, very senior in these corporations, and I think that's something which we haven't properly come to terms with. They're sort of embedded in the culture, and that allows them to sack Susan Sarandon or to get rid of Roger Waters or any of the hundreds and thousands of others who have been sacked, including in particular Muslim and Palestinian and Arab journalists who have been borne the brunt of this, as you would expect.
And of course, the murder of over 100 Palestinian journalists, I mean, they're targeted assassinations. It's against international law. But one of the aspects of that's taken place is the Zionists have had to come out front in their attack on academics, on journalists in a more public way, and that's exposed them in ways that they don't want to be exposed.
That's right, and that's where the pushback comes, and we're going to win on that. And look what they if you want to know what the Zionists think of academic freedom, look at what they've done in Gaza. They've physically destroyed every brick of every university in Gaza. And once they did that, in the case of the Islamic University of Gaza, once they destroyed it by early December, they went round to the house of the president and they killed him and all his family. I mean, that's what they think of academic freedom. And they would do the same in America and in the UK if they could. They can't get away with that, at least not at present. And so they indulge in the kind of tactics that they have. They have their campus lobby groups, they have their student lobby groups, they intimidate, they withdraw funding, they have people fired, all the things which we know about. So yeah, and that's what they think about academic freedom, that's what they think about freedom of the press. They're not in favor, as you perhaps would expect.
Okay, well, I want to thank you very much for joining us, David, and I'm happy you've won this case, and it's great vindication of your struggle and your effort to get the story out, the real story about what's going on with Zionism. And we hope you get your job back. I think students need to hear from you and hear about your research. So thanks for joining us on Work Week in Pacifica.
Thank you very much.